What I want to do now is an exercise that we do every year. It's very helpful. The exercise is to try and see an attack that happened on humanity. It is a demonic attack. So what we've seen so far is that there was a spiritual world, then the physical world was in the middle of it, and the physical world had poking through of things like the enemy tempting in the physical world, but coming from the spiritual world. Poking through, showing through the fabric underneath the material world is the spiritual world. Now, I want to take a moment and look at a story that starts with a genealogy. Chapter 5 is riveting. I mean, it will have you on the edge of your seat. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female. He blessed them and named them man in the day when he was created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness according to his image and called him appointed Seth. And then the days of Adam after he had became the father of Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. That's like, various and sundry, over 800 years you're going to have kids. Anyway, so all the days of Adam were 930 years and he died, and Seth lived 105 years and became the father of Enosh. It suggests to me that not only do they live longer, but they get involved in the procreation process later. I mean, we don't have a lot of 105-year-olds running around having babies, I'm just saying. But then it says he became the father of Enosh, mortal. So Adam is man. I want you to put next to the people the meaning of their name. And Adam is man. Seth is appointed. Who is Seth's child? Enosh, and Enosh is mortal. I'm going somewhere with all this. Hang in there. But if you follow Enosh down to verse 9, Enosh lived 90 years and became the father of Canaan. Anybody have a venture for a guess for Canaan? Sorrowful. His name is Canaan, means sorrowful. Canaan, in verse 12, Canaan lived 70 years and became the father of Mahalalel. Mahalalel is another important word, and it actually, El is in the word. Can you hear it? Can you see Hallel? Hallel is like a praise. Mahalalel is the blessed God. It's a form of praise. Now, whenever you have a Hebrew phrase like that, it could be the blessing from God, God's blessing, God is blessed. It can be any function of those words, okay? I'm going to use that particular one. Now, after Mahalalel, he has, let's see, verse 16, lived 130 years, and he became the father of Jared, or Yared. Yared is he shall come. It is it's a future tense of a verb, Yared. And Yored, Yared. At any rate, Yared, verse 18, lived 162 years, and he became the father of Enoch. Enoch it's a funny word. It's a word like to commence, to have the beginning of, or with commencement. Does that make sense to you? Do you understand what that word means? Commencement is like the beginning. with the beginning, or with the coming of, or with the, that's just the way the word is used. It's like to initiate, to begin, that kind of thing, okay? But Enoch has, in verse 21, Enoch lives 65 years. You notice he's having babies a little earlier, 65 years, and he became the father of Methuselah. Methuselah is Methuselah, and it means mat is like the word death. You'll see like with his death or by his death. So we'll use Methuselah. Could also be with his death or by his death. Methuselah, and actually you'll see a little bit later, I'm just looking for the verse, Methuselah will have, verse 25, Methuselah lived 180 years and became the father of Lamech, and Lamech means, Mat is by his death, Saleh he shall bring. His name means by his death he shall bring. And he has Lamech, and who does Lamech have? Who does Lamech have? Who's Lamech's son? Noach. Okay. This is despairing. Despairing or the despairing, and this is comfort. If you circle the names of the people and put the meaning of the name next to it or in the column, and what you'll have is in verse 1, Adam, verse 4, Seth, verse 6, Enosh, verse 8, Canaan, verse 12, Mahalalel, verse 16, Yared, verse 18, Enoch, verse 20, Methuselah, in verse 25, Lamech, and in verse 29, Noach. Now, if you take those words in Hebrew and write them on the board, it's a sentence. It's not a genealogy. It's a code. He did it on purpose. How do I know it's a code? Because if you go back and read chapters 3 and 4, he skips people in this genealogy. He doesn't give you the people that would be a proper genealogy. He's not trying to tell you a genealogy. Here's a hint. In Genesis, wherever Moses records a genealogy, it's about the next story. It sets up the next story. So what does it mean? If I wrote it out on a board for school children in Israel, they would say, Adam, Seth, Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel, Yared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noach. And what would that mean? It would mean man was appointed mortal and sorrowful. The blessed God, when he shall come down with his commencement, by his death he shall bring the despairing comfort. That's what it means. It's a sentence. He's telling you something's about to happen. And he's laid it into the text in a way that told the story. And the point of the story is this. Methuselah dies the year of the flood. And God brings comfort to a situation that is boiling on the earth. This is both a messianic promise and an immediate promise. Because something is about to happen. You should read that genealogy with a little kind of swelling anthem in the background. It's dun 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 dun, because the big shark is about to take a big bite out of somebody. Chapter 6, verse 1. Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and the daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. And they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Stop and read right there. There are two ways that this is read. Sons of God is a phrase that you will find used in places like Job to be angels. Some people say, well, that's not really angels, it's really people. But wait a minute, you mean it wasn't until there were a lot of girls they started to discover girls? That's what it says. It says when there were a lot of them, they started to discover they were beautiful. Listen, I know guys. From the beginning, the first one saw the first girl and she was looking good, okay? So this is about a spiritual incursion by the demonic beings into the race. And what it says is, then the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Naphal is the word fallen. Nephilim is the word fallen ones. This is a demonic statement, in my view. Those became the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. The Greeks called them titans. These were the Herculean characters with enormous strength and incredible size. Where did they come from? They came from a demonic incursion in the race in order to damage the bloodline of the race. Why? Because God made a statement that he was going to, through one of the women, foul the head of Satan's power, so Satan decided to go on a rampage and impregnate women. It was a great firing back, don't you think? If he can destroy the genetic purity of the race, he can, in a sense, set aside God's program, and he believes he's going to win. The thing you have to understand about Satan is he knows the Word of God, he just doesn't believe it. He was there when it all happened. He just doesn't believe it's going to end the way God says it's going to end. So there appears on the scene a group of people referred to as B'nai Elohim, the sons of the strong ones. That's what it actually should be translated. Various understandings have been offered. But in my view, the oldest understanding is the one that makes sense. The old rabbis all agreed with what I'm telling you. It's more recently, as people have moved away from a spiritual understanding of the world, that they've tried to eliminate this. Here's the thing. Satan doesn't believe God can pull off his promises. Satan believes he can outplay the Maker. So his demonic host of fallen ones follow the same misguided logic he does. And if you look again at the story, let's take it apart. Verses 1 and 2 are the setting. 6, 1 and 2, the setting. When people were spread out and they didn't all live together and they didn't all know each other, the enemy devised a plot to destroy the bloodlines. They began to take women as they chose. By the way, is there a Greek mythology that remembers this? Does anybody remember this? Do you remember what the satyrs were? They were often pictured as part goat, part man, and they would drag women off and rape women. It's remembered in old stories of literature that it became dangerous for women. And it's interesting because what this says is that they began to take the women as they chose, and a violation of their own place of habitation. You have to understand, when they decided to embody something and attempt to ruin the bloodlines of the women, they did something else. In God's ordered universe, everything has a place. So angels, or in this case, demonic beings, impregnating women was equal to you sleeping with your dog. It's an out-of-place mixture of things that should be separate. Does that make sense? God has an order to his world, and he doesn't let you go past that order without a violation or a breach. And so here, in the setting, it looks like Satan did something like imitating an animal, where his followers embodied like a human form or something. And at least in respect to sexual characteristics, are these satyrs, are they beasts, are they men? I don't know. Here's what I do know. They're mentioned in Mesopotamian literature. They're mentioned in ancient Greek literature. The oldest literature we have in mankind is that this went on. Okay? Now, verse 3 is the sentence. If verses 1 and 2 are the setting, verse 3 is the sentence. God decided to generally limit the length of man's lifespan to a much shorter time than it had up till then. So do you see it? When did lifespans get shorter? God stepped in and curved off most lifespans at about this point. That's what it says. He also took careful notice of the war that was developing on earth. The text says, God said his spirit will not strive. The word yadin means defend. I'm not going to keep going down there and defending this. That's what he says. God decided that this defense of man needed a definite and dramatic intervention, and he wanted to definitively come in and stop what was going on. Now, in verse 4, you have the strong ones. Here are the strong ones. The fallen ones, Nephilim, were the conjoining of these titans and demonic embodiments, and they were destroying the bloodline. And here's the thing. If you had something of this cataclysmic nature in the Bible, don't you think you'd see it somewhere else in the Bible? You do. Right next to that, 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. 2 Peter 2, 1 through 10. And then also, right before you turn there, Jude 1, 6 through 9. And also write 1 Peter 3, 17 to 20. Okay? That is, I'll go through them again. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. 2 Peter 2, 1 to 10. Jude 1, 6 through 9. 1 Peter 3, 17 to 20. So 2 of them are in Peter, 1 is in Jude. These are New Testament rememberings, in my view, of this event. Now listen to 2 Peter chapter 2 for a minute. False prophets also arose among the people, just as there will always be false teachers among you, who will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing swift destruction upon themselves. Many will follow their sensuality, and because of them, the way of truth will be maligned, and in their greed they will exploit you with false words. Their judgment from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. Stop right there. Do you notice that Peter says, people are going to come in with sexually licensing words and entice people who are part of God's people to be drawn away. That's what he says. He said they're going to come in, they're false prophets, and they're going to offer you sexual interpretations that allow you to do things God doesn't allow you to do. Does anybody have a hard time understanding that that's going on? It's happening. Now, this is what he says, though. In verse 4, he says, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to the pits of darkness reserved for judgment, and he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, the preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he had brought a flood upon the destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example to those who would live ungodly lives thereafter." And then he goes on and talks about Lot, and he talks about other things. Stop right there. Here's what he says. Peter goes back and says, you know, God knows how to judge. He didn't even spare those angels. You remember that time when they came in and God had to take them out and send them immediately to the pit of darkness and save mankind in the flood? That's what he says. Well, when did that happen? See, if chapter 6 of Genesis is not about demons, then that doesn't make sense. What he just said was there was a time when there was an angelic invasion and God stepped in and put them out of the game for the remainder. Here's what I want you to see. Genesis doesn't tell the whole story, it only tells part of it. Demonic incursion comes into the race. Women are being raped by demonic beings who are attempting to subvert the race so that Satan can, in the small number of people that are on the earth at that point, foul up every bloodline, making it impossible for God to bring Messiah out of one that is of clean blood. And so what happens is God steps in and takes the demons involved in it and takes them once and for all and casts them out of the game forever. In other words, they get no more opportunities to tempt anybody. They get no more opportunities to be involved in the negative things of the world. They are thrown, reserved for judgment in the pit of darkness right now, and they are still there. So, you mess with my people, and you step in and start ruining this, and I'm pulling you out of the game, and you will have nothing else to do. You will wait for judgment at the end, and you will be out of the game. You understand how I'm using the word game, right? Now, when did God, in the past tense, cast demons into hell? I think it's back here. I think that he mentions it just ahead of Noah's Ark, and I think that's the dead giveaway that that's what's going on in the background of the story. But if that doesn't help you, listen to what Jude said. Jude 1:6. "And angels who did not stay in their own domain, but abandoned the place of their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for judgment of that great day." He said there are some angels that didn't stay in the spiritual world, but came into the world of men, and God pulled them out, and they are awaiting judgment to this day. That's what he says. Then in verse 7, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they, in the same way as these, indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh. Listen to me. God calls what the angelic breach of going from their abode into the physical world, he calls homosexuality the same kind of egregious sin. That's what that said. He said, I made things with a certain order, and I do not accept you rewriting my rules. I have a way I want this to be. And so what he says is, just like Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them. And now it says in verse 8, yet in the same way, these men also by dreaming defile the flesh, reject authority, and revile angelic majesties. Remember in Sodom and Gomorrah, angels were brought to them, and they wanted to abuse them. They had no respect, not only for sexual rules, they had no respect for the fact that these were visitors that were sent with a message from God. They didn't care. Verse 9, but Michael the archangel, when he disputed with the devil and argued about the body of Moses, did not dare pronounce against him a railing of judgment, but said, the Lord rebuke you. In other words, demonic beings and Satan himself are to be respected for their position and not revered. So when Michael is fighting Satan, he doesn't use his own power. He uses the borrowed power of Jesus and says, the Lord rebuke you. Do you understand what I'm saying? Every now and then I see people playing around with demonic things that like they can go, well, you know, you just get in those face of those demons and you just tell them Jesus is empowering me. Don't get sassy with the demonic world. Don't get sassy. You come into that world respectfully and understand that you don't have power of your own. You borrow Jesus's power. And so you say, the Lord rebuke you. I grew up with a bigger brother. And my older brother was my guardian. So whenever I got in trouble, it was like, yeah, my brother's going to get you. That's how I want you to understand your position in the spiritual world. Stop thinking that you've earned some kind of position where you can go around rubbernecking and being sassy, because you can't. What you can do is be very careful and respectful, but revere God only. Now, it's interesting because the argument appears to be that angels did not stay in their own place of dwelling. That's what orkaterion means, the word given habitation in Jude. They didn't stay in their own place of dwelling. Well, where did they go? Well, at some point or points in the past, God stepped in and pulled them out because they were doing something wrong, not in their own habitation. I think that's what Genesis 5 and 6 is all about. Now, 1 Peter 3 also addresses this one. Let me just read to you that 1 Peter 3 even suggested a direct work of Jesus in warning off demonic activity of the age before the flood. This is what it says. This is 1 Peter 3:17. For it is better, if God should will it so, that you suffer for doing what is right rather than for doing what is wrong. Everybody on that page? In other words, it's not exactly persecution for Jesus that you got thrown in jail if you stole the car. That's not really persecution for Jesus, that's you stole the car, right? He said it's better if you get persecuted for doing right rather than get thrown in jail for doing wrong. But then he says this, for Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which also he went in and made proclamation to the spirits that are now imprisoned, who once were disobedient, when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah, during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. So he goes back to the Noah time, and in 1 Peter 3, it appears as though Jesus came and warned the demonic spirits that if they engaged women on the earth, they would suffer immediately and an irreversible judgment. In other words, Jesus came and said to them, look, boys, you'd pull this off and you're out of the game for the duration. I'm not kidding. They did it anyway, and they're out of the game for the duration, reserved and waiting for judgment. So when I get to Genesis 6:5, back where I started, Then the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. I see that humanity is acting out in rebellion, but there's also the incursion in the race that's going on. Both things are happening. People are being rebellious, and the rebels are being incited and helped and aided by the Nephilim, these titans. As men got bigger, they got sassier. Strong and powerful people walking around like, yeah, we could take on God, you know? And then it says, the Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. The Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. But listen, but Noah, comfort, found favor in the eyes of the Lord. These are the records of the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man and blameless in his time. Underline the word righteous and the word blameless. It sounds like God got disgusted with the evil of men, but there's another way to understand the Hebrew text altogether. That's not what I think. I don't think he's going, I'm so disgusted with what I made. I don't think that's what he's saying. The translation here is every form, yetzer, of the making of the heart was evil. The making of the heart, mashshevet, the kind of the machinations of the heart. In other words, the bloodlines of man were almost entirely corrupted, and God found one righteous man. And what he said about him, the word, he was a righteous man, blameless. That word blameless is the word tamim. That's one you're going to want to know. The word tamim is what your sacrifice needed to be. And it means of clean blood without blemish. Most of us think that when they say bring a lamb that is without blemish, that it meant he had no, sores on him. But no, it also has to do with that he's from a pure line. So it has both aspects involved in it. It's both a genetic thing. By the way, when we start studying Jacob, you're going to find out that they're very, very clear about the kinds of sheep and goats they want and which flocks they get and what colors or spots they are. So preferably they would bring for a sacrifice, they would bring an animal that was one color, one type, and came from both clean blood and had no blemish and no markings on it. Now here's what's important. It says, I don't want you to get lost in all the detail, the passage of the flood is set up by a demonic attack on the race. God fires back by killing off the bloodlines by sending the flood. I want you to know that in the Bible, there's something about the movement of spirits and dry land. The place that they don't thrive is in water. God moved the waters away, created dry land, and then created conscious life on the dry land. There's something, we have a story in the Gospels where Jesus, in Mark's Gospel, casts demons into the swine. The swine go into the water and they die. The one place that they don't seem to be able to pull off this kind of incursion is in places of water. So for whatever reason, God decides to flood the earth because he can eliminate the entire problem. By the way, there are fast and easy ways to eliminate the population without flooding the whole earth. The problem is, if there is a demonic incursion, what's going to happen if he lets the animals live? Where's the only other place the demon can go? Animals. They went into the pigs, right? So the point is, he's got to kill not only the people, he's got to kill the animals as well. He does not have to kill all plant life. He doesn't have to kill fish. He doesn't have to, there's certain things that are not part of this. We don't know what the rules are. We simply know that in Scripture we have a case, a precedent of the demonic incursion going into animals. So we know that he's got to kill the people and animals that come from a fallen bloodline. So he's only going to collect on the ark clean animals from clean lines. Now, the ark then becomes a different kind of story. sometimes I get people who will say to me, the God of the Old Testament seems like he's mean, and then the God of grace shows up in the New Testament. And so you have the Old Testament where God's like smiting people and killing people on the earth. If I heard a story about, if I heard that Ben Russell went out and shot 3 people, I would be like, oh, Ben, how could that happen? Then I find out that the backstory is that there were 3 ISIS characters that were about to blow up a mall, and he spotted them, and somehow he got access to a weapon and shot them. He's now not a bad guy, he's a hero, right? So God looks like he's bad for the wiping out of the earth, unless what he's doing is saving mankind. What he's doing is saving the plan, and that's why the ark becomes a story of God's rescue, not the flood, a story of man's destruction. Now, from the lost world's perspective, they're going to look at this, and all they're going to see, because they don't accept the spiritual reality, they're only going to see the physical world and say, your God went around killing everybody on earth. And that's true, but that's not the proper perspective with which to see this. So my point is that the story is actually a story of God's rescue. That's a little bit challenging, and it's a little bit hard to grasp. Is everybody with me? Are there any questions? Dennis?
In verse 7, 6, he says he was sorry. Is that a pretty literal translation then?
It's not. The question is about, does God change his mind? Does God get sorrowful and regret? I am the Lord, I change not. How does that fit with this? And I'm going to take you back to what I said last week, which is the Bible is not written to tell you how God does what God does. It only tells you the piece of it that you need to know of the story for you to respond the way you need to respond. So God spoke to Moses and told Moses, man, I was kicking my own butt about how he even made mankind after that. Does that mean that's what he was doing? Or does that mean, you have to remember that implies time on God. God, who is timeless, doesn't have a discussion with himself about how he felt bad about yesterday's decision, because there isn't a yesterday. But how are you going to grasp that? You're not. So another anthropomorphism of God, that is to put wings that we can hide under and a strong right hand in which he grasps us, none of which he has, is the imagery of saying God was really rethinking, I'm not trying to rob the literal sense of the text. I'm trying to tell you that at the end of the day, you're never going to understand how God does what God does. And every one of your questions, especially those of you who grew up with theology being Bible, you're going to keep going back to that. Because almost all the discussions that you had up to this point in your life weren't about the application of principle. They were mostly about how your theology is cemented by what you read. Everybody's going to be on the theology page. But here's the fact of the matter. You don't have any idea how God works. He says he doesn't change, and he says he does. How does that work? You have no idea. Because there's no way for him to explain it. That's what he was trying to say to Job. I could tell you, but you'd never get it. I can't tell you. You don't understand. Aaron Michaud used to have a way of presenting this. He was one of the former directors of GCBI. And he said, it would be like, let's say you and I live in a 2-dimensional world. A page is 2 dimensions, okay? So we live in length and width. But God is 3-dimensional, okay? So God decides to pass through our world. And first, he looks like, a couple of dots. Then he looks like, just keep slicing this. Now he looks like part of a hand. Now he looks like a shoulder. Now he looks enormous like a body. Now he looks like one arm. Now he looks like, and now it's all the way down to a finger. And after he passes through, what do you suppose the 2-dimensional figures will say he looked like? Do any of you think that they would have any concept of a 3-dimensional being as 2-dimensional beings? No. And that's why I told you that Einstein said that there are 14 different dimensions that we can calculate mathematically. Maimonides thought there were 18. Here's the reality. I can only think in length, width, height, and time. I can do 4. Okay, so let's be honest. You're not going to get it. You're going to keep coming back and going, I don't understand. Exactly. Fortunately, there's no part of the GCBI curriculum that requires you to understand how the universe is run, or the part of the Holy Spirit will not be played by you today. So you don't have to worry about running it. At the same time, we have this theological need in the West to ask questions that a Middle Easterner would never have asked. They would never go, well, did God think that way or not? They would go, that's God. You don't ask that. So clearly in the story, it's right to say, it looks like he changed his mind. It looks like he regretted. Later on, he's going to tell you that that's not really me. It's not really how it works. I see no contradiction there, because it's the same contradiction as I have a strong right hand, except for I'm a spirit and I don't have hands. Technically, that's a contradiction. Actually, it's not. Okay? I don't know if I helped you or you're just sitting here going, okay, so here's what we got now. We get to chapter 6, verse 9, and we start to move into the next section. These are the records of the generations of Noah, meaning these are the records of those that follow him. I'm going to spend a few minutes here, then we'll go to a break, because that'll allow them to take care of the cameras and whatnot. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his time. Blameless, of course, is that key word, tamim. He is complete, he is sound, he is uncorrupted, unblemished. That's what I think the point of the story is. One of the strongest objections people have to belief in God is the problem of death and suffering. And the notion that there is a God is fought in modern society. Provided God is tailor-made to our choosing, we're okay with having God. As long as he supports our decisions, rescues our failings, and generally does our bidding, we're all in favor of God. In other words, America would really rather have genie in a lamp, okay? If we could just kind of rub it with Americanism and he would pop out and make us like the strongest, richest, most powerful, enduring nation, we would serve that God whenever we wanted to rub the lamp. The problem is the violent intolerance of the world toward a personal God declares something right and wrong can be seen in there's a New York Times article, I'm trying to remember who wrote it a couple of years ago. And it was talking about how, oh man, I'm not going to get this. Let me say it this way, I'm going to paraphrase this loosely. This guy wrote this article, and it was basically talking about how Americans do religion, and it went something like this. In the beginning, man created God to soothe his loneliness and make him feel he had purpose. That was the humanist kind of rewriting Genesis 1. Man created God to make him feel purposeful and keep him from being lonely. Now, I argued in our earlier classes that that's counterintuitive. It's stupid. Why would people make up a whole bunch of rules and then not keep them and feel guilty about them? That doesn't even make any sense. Why would you create a God that you didn't want to follow? I can understand if you created a God that said you could do whatever you wanted, but I can't understand why you would create this God with all these rules and then go, yeah, and then we all perish because we're all sinners. What story is this if it's made up? It's terrible. By the way, you would not have written the Bible the way it's written. Think about this. Basically, we all come from Moses, and he's an ex-con who murdered a guy and then ran into the wilderness. Is this how you would tell your story? George Washington, the mass murderer before he was our first president and found. Now, come on! How about this? Your priests all come from what tribe? Levi. So would you start off with the Levites basically being a bunch of lascivious monsters that were almost eliminated in the period of Judges before they became the holy household? I mean, really, is this how you would tell your story? Would you say we're a bunch of ex-cons that ran away from Egypt, and then we had a bunch of sexually licensing people, and God nearly smote us 47 times in the wilderness and swallowed up some guys, and this is how we got to be the special chosen people? I mean, really, is that the way you tell the story? No, because every ancient text by every ancient people made up by those people exalts the people. Frankly, you don't have to go very far into Genesis and you're thinking, man, the people are really bad. Our academic world leads the way in the pursuit of a man-made God. And as a result, I think when we get here to chapter 6, verse 9, it's worth seeing the way the Bible proposes it. In 6:9 to 7:5, this is part of the third section or scroll of the book. Remember the prologue, 1:1 to 2:3, right? And what we learned in the prologue was what? Let's review it really quick. God is the first cause of everything, right? God created all that exists. God set time. God set up the physical world. God owns everything. There's no competing equal. And God created everything good. He liked it, but it fell within his judicial responsibility to say what it was for and how it was to work. What gives you the right to tell some people who they can love? You can't tell people who they can love. No, the Creator is allowed to tell you anything he wants to tell you. Why? Because all parameters are made by the one who created the game. Then, in the first scroll we studied, in 2:4 to 4:26, what did we see? We saw that God provided work, and work was good or bad? Good. God set limitations on man, made him work the garden. Man took responsibility for the creatures. He named them. We also found that God created a helper, and he named her Chava, and he called her and took responsibility for her. And man's failure was what in the garden? Well, I'm sorry? To protect her. He did not guard her. So God judged man and woman, and as he revealed he would, he expelled them from the garden, and he expelled man. After he was expelled, man began to increase in number and in sin and lies and murders, and finally some groups formed. They were illustrated by Llama's song of arrogance, and Enosh and the worship of the Lord. Now, in 5:1 to 6:8, in the scroll we just saw, which is the second scroll, God revealed how he promised to save the race and how he pulled it off. And in 5, what you have is an underlying story, and in 6, you have the way he pulled it off. Okay? So by the time you get to 6:9, we're going to pick it up just after our break, but by the time you get to chapter 6, verse 9, here's what you're going to see. You're going to see that God is sovereign over the universe, and God chooses everything for the purposes that he's the only one that understands. Look at 6:9. It says, these are the records of the generation of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his time. Noah walked with God. Noah became the father of 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now here's the thing. Can you all identify, there was no way for Noah to recognize why God chose his family. Noah didn't know what his genes were. He didn't know what his great-grandma had done. Okay? So let's just put it very clearly. He couldn't see his own genetics. All he knew was God chose to follow his life, and he chose to follow God. And that is as it should be. We don't have to understand why God does what he does, and we don't have to understand why he puts us in play. Think about it. You don't know why God has you here. You haven't a clue. And some of you are wondering why you chose to be here. You're going, what am I doing here? That's okay. Here's what I want you to understand. We are called to trust and obey. He has the plan. We don't have the plan. You're not asked, you don't have a plan to make for your life. I want to take this away from you before you go to a break. You are not supposed to create a plan for your life. You don't have a plan to make. You have a path to follow. There's already a plan for you. What you're asking God to do is blow the leaves off the path so you can see where it is. Because right now, there's leaves everywhere and you can't tell which way you're supposed to go. But there's a path under those leaves and it's your path. And what you've got to ask God to do is blow it off so you can see it. Now we're going to come back and start looking at Shem, Ham, and Japheth and play out how the next phase of this story goes.